Hello, Pirates of Penzance. My name is TB Skyen. And do you remember a good while ago now, Riot put out an audio drama in conjunction with the Pike reveal, where they basically told a bunch of stories from Bilgewater using a particular character called Lars, who told us stories about Fizz and Nautilus and all kinds of interesting stuff. Well, I thought that was really interesting, and so I was quite excited to get reached out to by a couple of members of the Riot narrative team who offered me the opportunity to see the actual script for this audio drama. And you can too. It's in a link down in the description down there. I've been given permission to share the PDF with all of you, and you should take a read out of it because it's really fascinating. And we are going to talk about it. I say we because I am joined today by a couple of members of the team who actually created it, if you guys want to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, hello. I'm Laurie Goulding. Many people know me as Scathlocke on the Riot forums and online. And I was, I guess, the editor and something of a producer on the Legends of Bilgewater audio.
And hi, everyone. I'm Anthony Reynolds. I was the writer on these pieces.
So, this particular audio piece, the idea of having an audio drama in League of Legends is something that I wanted for a very long time, so I was really excited when it came out. So I'd love to hear if is that something that's been sort of percolating in the narrative team for a while, or was that out of the blue all of a sudden, hey, let's do this cool thing?
That's really interesting. This is something that Ant and I worked on a lot of these audio dramas in the past. We worked for Games Workshop and for other folks. We had worked together as editor and writer on pieces like this. And when I came over to Riot Games, Ant was saying, like, this is one of those things we definitely need to do some of these. And it was about finding the right opportunity and the right, the right content, I guess, to do one of these. But Ant, you had some great thoughts on this, like, around that time as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think audio is just really exciting. It's such an interesting, engaging way to, hear a story. As a writer, I find it really exciting because just hearing someone reading your story brings it all to life, often in ways that, it sounds almost better than the way I imagined it. So yeah, it was just something that we'd always wanted to do a lot more of, and this was kind of a great little avenue to jump in and give it a test run, really.
That is interesting. Is that something that you guys are still... I mean, I know I'm asking you to spoil something you absolutely can't spoil, but is that something that you might want to do again in the future a little bit more?
I would love to do more audio drama. There's a lot of folks at Riot who heard this and have asked for more information about, how can we learn more about this medium? Or some folks who are like, I've got some great ideas. Let's talk about different ways we can produce this. We reached out to a couple of folks in the industry, such as James Swallow, who's another writer I've worked with before, and Dirk Maggs, who's a very highly regarded, well-respected audio writer, director, producer from the UK. Has done a lot of stuff for the BBC and other great audio drama content. And both of them came over and sort of spoke to Rioters about what else was possible in the medium and their best practices and the way to go about structuring stories specifically for audio drama. I'd love to do more. I'd love to do more of these.
Yeah,
I will be very happy to write more.
Yeah, I'll remind our viewers that this is not a confirmation that anything is coming, but at least a confirmation that you're open to the idea.
Absolutely. and we are totally open to doing more of these, right?
Very much so, yes.
All right. Let me know if you need a voice, if you need someone to do a background. I mean, I know a guy. I'm not going to tell you who he is, but I know a guy. So, Legends of Bilgewater came out. It did a lot to update some of the stories of Nautilus and Fizz and announce Pike. Basically, it sort of all led up to this crescendo at the end where we meet Pike and he kills our poor narrator. Spoiler alert for those who haven't listened to it yet. Was it intended as a promo for Pike from the start, or was that more of a thing of, we want to do this audio drama, where's the opportunity for that? And then Pike comes along and you go, hey, pirate stories, yay!
So we were, at the time it was, Ariel Lawrence was the lead writer for League and I was the lead editor. We'd been talking about the possibility of doing audio drama content. And when Pike was being worked on, one of the sound designers, very talented chap, Brian Higger, he had done kind of a story sketch, an audio story sketch to help figure out what Pike's sound effects in-game might sound like. And it wasn't just here's here's his stealth mode, here's his here's his weapon sound effects. But he sort of built this kind of soundscape that was to sound like Bilgewater, to sound like some backstreet where a guy goes walking down the street and gets attacked by Pike, and there's a little bit of dialogue, and it was done at the same time as a lot of the champion DNA, a lot of the ideation, and it just sat on a drive somewhere. And I think everyone assumed it was just a bit of kind of work in progress to try and figure out the champion. And then we got hold of it and we heard it, and I was like, this is amazing, and we should actually produce something like this. And everybody, including Brian, was very excited by that. I think that's the point at which we reached out to you, Ant, because of your experience in this medium before.
Yeah, and I think that would just sort of led into it. Seemed like a really good opportunity to hit some champions that we hadn't really touched on for quite a while. And it just so happened that some of those ones all sort of fit into the same kind of almost mythical space. All the characters that we used here are kind of ones that they kind of fit into that place of being like, how would people regard them? Are they kind of like myths and legends? Are they sort of dark tales? And sort of from that, we kind of concocted this little idea about like, what if it's just a sort of like a bit of a story? Someone's just telling stories about these champions, and it kind of all led from there, really.
And we had quite recently, Ariel had reached out to players directly, and we'd been sort of hearing people's opinions on what Nautilus meant to them as players, as Nautilus mains, as players who play against Nautilus, that kind of thing. And we had a whole bunch of information about that. So we knew we were going to update Nautilus's bio, and we wanted to make sure that we got it right. And I think that we had that stack of notes on the proverbial desk when these conversations were happening about audio. And that, I guess, we supplied those over to you, Ant, and that's where that particular part of the story sort of came from.
Yeah, and then with like Fizz, I think it was around that sort of time that we were properly establishing him as more of a Bilgewater character and trying to figure out how does he actually fit into that place. But yeah, sort of all sort of came around and came with this central character of going like, what sort of tales would someone be telling about these various sort of strange and slightly creepy characters?
So it basically is just this lucky confluence of a whole bunch of things that ended up creating a project like this.
Definitely, there's a lot of lucky confluences lead to great stuff for us. Yeah, it's always cool to be able to tie things together like that.
And it's often the way that we do things. Like we can see like the launch of a new champion or the relaunch of an older champion as like an opportunity. It's like what other things can we do around that champion that might help explain who they are or where they come from, but also gives us a chance to touch back to some older stuff that we haven't looked at for a little while.
That was a great thing to sort of lean into, was the idea that Pike very quickly is becoming like a new legend in Bilgewater. Like, people are not sure if he's real, they're not sure if, like, you know, is the Blood Harbor Ripper real, like that kind of thing, to set him up alongside all these much older legends. And I think at the very end, the bartender character sort of calls that out, like old legends sort of fade and new legends are born.
So was this I know you guys work for the narrative department, but I would imagine you don't have a bunch of sound engineers on staff in there, so was this like a collaboration between multiple departments to get this thing to work? Yeah,
we reached out to we have a head of sort of the voices and the acting side of things for all of our products, Champion VO and the various cinematic things when there's narration in character, that kind of thing. And it's a guy called David Lyerly, who's he has a lot of experience in this area, and he really loves the audio ideas that we had put forward. He also helped sort of spearhead the Swain CG at the beginning of 2018, the very short kind of introductory thing. And he helped us to get the actor in to re-record sections of dialogue and stuff like that. And so we were just coming off the back of that project when we started talking about this one. And he was like, "I'd love to be involved. I will help you in any way I can." And he really he helped us like refine the scripts. And he had loads of notes for Ant as we were adapting this stuff. And like we did. He sort of led on targeted read-throughs of the script. And had you worked with David before like directly on anything, or was this the first time?
No, not really. This was pretty much the first stuff, but it was a fantastic experience. I learned a lot, so it was great.
So working with a voice actor, like when you need anyone to record audio as opposed to League of Legends, it's a bit of a question of how do we explain to them what kind of world this is, where we have like Hextech and Son and also pirates and also the desert and God knows what else. Like what was the process of trying to get the actor, or the actors rather, to understand the kind of world that they were portraying? Did they do a cold read, or did you have like a process with them?
I think to begin with, Ant, we did kind of like a read through. We did a read through, like producer, writer, editor, and a couple of other folks in the room to try and like fit the tone for ourselves, because there's a lot of stuff that we really like about the shorthand of like, hey, imagine a pirate telling tall tales in a bar, but then equally there's like, we want to try and lean into other areas for Bilgewater, like the monster hunting side, the kind of not just relying on one note but trying to explore various different ones. And I think some of the stuff before we even brought actors in, there was a little bit of refinement work that went on. And again, Ant, you wrote in a lot of the kind of like the way that he spoke. You wrote Lars's accent into the script in many ways.
Yeah, I find with audio in particular, it's something like if I'm writing something for audio, I want to always read it out loud to myself as it's going, kind of thing, just to make sure that you're getting the sort of the right feel of things or the right flow. And I mean, I often try to do that with prose work as well, particularly with dialogue. But I think for audio stuff, it's super important. But one of the things with this was that we wanted to try and make sure that if someone was hearing it, they didn't have to have a huge amount of assumed knowledge about Bilgewater and our world anyway. And I kind of imagined Lars as being that kind of character that is just going to explain things to you anyway, even if you know. He's like that guy that you've all met in the pub that's explaining something to you that you already know about. But I thought that was a good way of like him introducing concepts to people in a way that's not trying to hammer it in like this is like heavy background lore that you have to know to understand. Like, try and introduce it in a way which flows well with his storytelling, but also means that if you don't know anything about our worlds, you can understand it. And I think that might. I mean, I think that might have helped the actors a little bit, because just the way you read it, you're kind of learning as you go in a sense. I don't think it needed them to have a huge in-depth understanding of Bilgewater other than what you get here, if that makes sense.
I think a lot of it's contextual in that way, and I think there was I think in the room, everybody, all of us, the actors, like the sound producer and everybody, we sort of realized halfway through, everybody knows somebody like Lars in some way. Like there's always that one guy who's going to tell you a story whether you want to hear it or not, and you might not believe everything he's saying, but like we all know somebody like that one way or another. And I think that's for me, that's something really important to do with the the Runeterra setting and the whole League of Legends kind of as a setting, is to try and make it feel more authentic and approachable, and not just rely on deep lore and you must know this stuff, otherwise it's not going to work. And I think having it be approachable kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure, because it can be super like impenetrable otherwise. It's easy to write with an assumed knowledge because we've been writing in this world for years, but I always try and take a step back and go like, wait, I don't want someone just to bounce completely off this going like, I don't know what all of this means. So you're trying to write in a way which can introduce concepts to you or remind people of concepts. I mean, there's so much, we've got so many champions and there's so much written about them these days that it's hard to expect everyone to know every single little minute detail all the time. So like, I think finding ways to reintroduce concepts to people, which isn't just like hitting them over the head with the lore Bible kind of thing, is part of the trick.
God, I'd love to see try to see the lore Bible for the League of Legends. It must be enormous.
It's like 14 tons of paper. It's terrifying. You can't even open it.
It's just this giant tome that sits in the corner and pulses with evil energy. Yeah.
Have you seen it? That's exactly what it is.
I've seen it in my dreams.
Constantly growing.
So diving into the actual script a little bit, one thing I noticed reading through like the script compared to the final audio drama is that a lot of the sort of the atmospheric direction and the sound effects, a lot of those were kind of tuned down a little bit for the actual final recording compared to what was read. Was that a budget thing where like, oh, we have to get all this Foley and sound effects, that'll take a million years, or was it more of a thing of, oh, it works better if we keep it light?
It's actually somewhere between the two. So, like, Ant and I, we'd worked on, like, Ant had written the stories, and also it's worth pointing out that all three of the stories, so Nautilus, Fizz, and Tahm, Kench, those stories were slightly adapted into prose, and they're the color stories for those champions. So you still have that kind of consistent approach within the world and within the Bilgewater kind of corner of it. But there was somewhere between the two where we had figured out this is what we think it would sound like, and this is the kind of direction we think they need based on the read-throughs and based on our previous work in this area. But then when we actually heard the first pass, of the full production with a lot of those sound effects in, it felt a bit much. It's like there was a little bit too much focus on the background, and in some cases it kind of detracted from the actual stories. And it's like distracting levels of sound effects, and suddenly you're listening to the sound effects and you've forgotten what the narrator's saying, or your attention just wanders. And it's a really interesting balance to try and hit, which was something that never really occurred to me about this script specifically until we actually heard it produced. And again, I'd love to call out the sound designer and producer who was working with us actually in the studio was Sean Ballas. Very, very talented guy. Again, we work with a lot of very talented people at Riot, but he took the script and then built this huge library of like every relevant sound effect and everything that we thought we might need. Apart from children's voices, they're pretty hard to source, as it turns out.
Well, we might get to that in the Fizz story, actually, talk a little bit about those kids' voices.
Sure.
But for now, I kind of want to dive a little bit into the Ophidian, because that's kind of the introductory story. That's the moment we get to know Lars, we get to understand what the heck is this thing that's going on here. So the decision specifically to have Lars as a central storyteller, where did that kind of come from? You touched on it a little bit previously, but, you know.
Well, part of it was practical. We pulled these together pretty quickly, actually, and we kind of did them on a bit of a shoestring, and we had this great voice actor. So it was like we sort of thought one good way of doing it. Like often with audios, you have different actors playing all the different characters, and but for this one, we sort of decided we'll just have the one central character, kind of keep it a little bit more limited in scope, and have him kind of narrating through the entire thing. So yeah, from that we just sort of came up with the slightly lovable, slightly drunk, slightly like guy who tells tall tales sitting in the corner of the room.
The guy everybody knows.
Yeah. So what about the bartender who bookends the story? Like where did she come into it? When you had Lars, what was the need for the bartender to kind of?
I think if I remember rightly, because this is going back a little bit of time, I think I wrote those last as a framing device. So I wrote the 3 stories first, and then we sort of decided that we needed a kind of framing device that just sort of helps sort of set everything up, sort of set up what Bilgewater is in a few lines, as well as kind of like informing everybody about what you're about to get, and then kind of have something at the end which sort of dovetails it all and just sort of pulls it all together again, saying, yep, just a reminder, these are all sort of these different tall tales.
I'm trying to remember back to when we did the first draft. As you say, like this came together in the space of about 72 hours. I think Ant wrote this. Yeah, he really turned this around really quickly. We had like a good hour-long like meeting about this is what it needs to be, and these are all the things, and you've written these before, I've edited these before, I'm sure we can pull something together. And I think the very first like piece that you wrote, I think it was about 700 or 800 words, just a little chunk just to say this is how I think we're going to pitch it. And I think originally we had it being narrated, and there were characters talking underneath this narrator, and I think very quickly we realized like, oh, that doesn't feel quite as authentic, having like an out-of-body narrator. So putting some of that into the book ending with the barkeep, I think that was a decision we made quite early on through experimentation there.
Yeah, and I think I hooked into like Lars's voice, the way that he spoke quite quickly, and I think everyone kind of just liked the way that he was sounding. So it's just like, oh,
yeah,
do a bit more with that.
The stuff where he was sort of explaining in his voice was more interesting than the narration that we already had.
Yeah, well, it adds a whole different layer to it then when you've got like a character telling you a story is just slightly different than just a cold sort of narration.
Yeah.
Speaking of framing devices, like in the Ophidian, we have this unnamed character that Lars is talking to, who's sort of assumed to be the listener themselves, kind of. And then in Fizz, he's telling the story to these little kids. Like, what was the decision to not be Lars monologuing at one guy all the time, but to change his audience?
I think part of that was, well, I just thought the idea of him telling Fizz as a kid's story, a sort of dark kid's story, I thought was just kind of fun. Plus, I kind of like the idea of like this guy's sitting in this pub all day. He's like propping up the bar, and everybody that wanders in, he's like, I've got a story to tell you, kind of thing.
If you
it's
buy
just
me
like,
a drink,
God,
yeah.
he's gonna yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like I was half imagining that maybe that first one was like in the morning. This is he's there, and then the kids are there in the sort of mid-afternoon or something, and then the gambling Tahm Kench one is probably very late at night, and then he stumbles off into the darkness in the wee small hours. So this is almost like his day.
He might have told
he
might have told a bunch of other stories to a bunch of other people. We just didn't focus on those.
Yeah.
That's quite cool. So when it comes to writing, like you said, there's this difficulty of bringing people into this dense lore. So balancing this idea of the exposition that was necessary, like you needed to get Lars to explain what the heck the tithe is, so that we can understand why Nautilus attacks the ship and stuff like that. And so, what I'm curious about that, like how hard was that process to kind of balance that the exposition that the listener needs versus, well, these people already live there, they should know this already.
Yeah, it can be tricky, and I think sometimes it's done better than in other places. For this one, I was just trying to imagine, like, who would he tell this to then? So I kind of just had this little narrative in my head of like, well, what if this is someone that's just sort of fresh off the boat kind of thing, that this is their first time to Bilgewater, and he's like, well, you know about the tithe, right? And then imagining them going, the what? And him going, what? You don't know about the tithe? Oh. And then he sort of launches into it. I don't know. It can be hard. It can be tricky. As I said, sometimes you just need to write it down, read it out, get some people's opinions, because I know with myself anyway, I can often, if I'm staring at a script or a piece of writing for a little while, I get a bit blind to it. I'm like, is this too heavy? Is this working? I don't really know. So that's when I have to rely on other people to go, does this sound like it's too expositional, or is this working?
Yeah, if this came together in like 72 hours, you must not have had a lot of time for feedback. Not
a hell of a lot of time. We had a little bit more time after it was written, when we're doing the records and stuff, so we could do a few, like, rewrite a few lines and stuff on the fly. But yeah, it was turned around pretty quick.
I remember when we were looking for feedback, there was actually a narrative sort of meeting for everybody in the discipline, all the writers and editors, and we just had like 20 minutes left at the end of this meeting, when all of the business had been covered, and I just said, guys, can I just read something out loud to you and get your thoughts on it? And I started reading straight at the beginning of the Ophidian story, and I think probably Matt Dunn or somebody shouted up like, you have to do the accent. Okay, so I think that was I kind of blasted through the whole script for everybody in the narrative discipline. Normally we would do this by email, like people would read through something. Maybe we might have a table read for the writers and editors to kind of get their head around something and then compile some notes. But I think basically in this case, we had that one read through and everybody just threw their notes at me at the end, and I wrote them down, and then I said, okay, Ant, who wasn't in the meeting, Ant, I've got this feedback, this is the stuff we need to work on, and we have like an hour before the read through with David Liley.
It does make this whole thing much more impressive, like to know how fast it came together. Yeah,
this was something Ariel pushed for really hard, was we needed to get this turned around quickly to make sure that it actually happened, because at the time we knew that it had to be translated in some form into Mandarin for the China players in China. We weren't sure if other regions were going to have translated versions of it at that point, but we needed to build in enough time for those teams to actually record it if they wanted to. As it turns out, we just did it in English and Mandarin, and everybody else got the translated version of the prose for the color stories.
There's certainly nothing like a good deadline to get things moving.
So, returning to the issue of exposition, this is my little pet bugbear that I always return to almost when I criticize League of Legends writing and lore. Using in-universe terminology like Axefin Leviathan and Razorfin and Berserker, like these words that are very specific to the League of Legends universe. Like balance for me when I see those words, I always go, oh, that's a very specific term, and I kind of in the back of my head I expect someone to explain exactly what it is. And that to me has always been a little bugbear in League of Legends, that there's all this in-universe terminology that's kind of used to world build, to kind of give the impression that these people have a vocabulary. But it's rare that an explanation or an importance to, oh, it's specifically an Axefin Leviathan versus another kind of Leviathan. Like, what's your particular? I'm gonna force this issue into this discussion. If I can. What's your guys' like sort of opinion on this in-universe terminology versus just calling it a shark rather than a berserker shark?
Sure, I think it's a good thing to talk about, and I like it, but I also know that sometimes we can go too far with it, and I'm certainly can be guilty of that. I like a certain amount of it because I feel like it does make this feel like its own place, but I also know that if you're just saying meaningless words, then it also can bounce people and can mean nothing. So if it was just like there's the oceans are full of wibble wobbles and bloopies, it's just like I don't have any concept of what that is. But if it's like in these examples with berserker sharks or razorfish, at least I understand that they're fish and sharks. You know what I mean? And I think if we were renaming everything, it starts to get ridiculous. Like I think a horse should still be a horse.
Yeah.
You know, like there's a certain degree of like how much adds color to the particular location, does a little bit of world building for that, and how much is just too much and just bounces out. It's not exactly. Well, it's not an exact science, I don't think.
I think that it's something that's happened kind of inconsistently throughout Riot's history. Like, and it's something that happens to all IPs and all settings as they grow, is the first ideas are developed as time goes on. I don't think until maybe 2 years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, nobody actually ever kept track of all the different things that had ever been made up for this world.
Yeah.
And also, there was no real way to kind of impress upon folks. Like, for me, if I was reading about, let's say, about Demacia, and this actually came up in a discussion recently, if I'm reading about Demacia and suddenly it mentions a Demacian knight needing a cup of coffee in the morning, I'm like, nope, okay, this isn't a fantasy world for me anymore. That's very real world and very specific. Do they have coffee in Demacia? Like, do they have coffee in Runeterra? Like, and we can talk about Noxian tacos until the proverbial end of time. But I think
because tacos imply the existence of Mexico.
There are, I think this is all part of one great big kind of conversation about how much knowledge do you need to have in order for something to be explained without diving into it too much. So it's like Axefin Leviathan, talking about in context. If you can understand what something is in context, that is a lot more useful than, in my opinion, just calling it by a real world name, especially a super specific like cultural name, like referring to a Ronin or a samurai. That's real world like connotation involved, as opposed to swordmaster. Swordmaster works like a wandering swordmaster. That's a much more elegant way of putting it. And for people that don't understand the shorthand context of that real world thing, that could also be confusing. It just, again, as you just said before, Ant, it sounds like the boobly boo or the wibbly wobbly. Like, it doesn't mean anything without context. But an Axefin Leviathan, that sounds mean. That sounds horrible. Like, it sounds huge. I don't want to confront one of those. But then if it had just a crazy made up long, like even a Latin like species designation, that kind of implies something about Runeterra. Like, oh, they have Latin in Runeterra apparently. Like, you start to have these, you start to write checks that you're eventually going to have to cash if you're going to explain that kind of stuff. I think it's easier to do shorthand with things that are recognizable, like berserker shark. Okay, I understand what a shark is. I understand that there's a kind of berserker shark. I mean, I should just point out, by the way, that I'm terrified of fish, and I also have that thalassophobia, which is the fear of death.
Thalassophobia, yeah, fear of the ocean.
So I am utterly, utterly terrified by everything we ever do with Bilgewater, and the artwork of little tiny little version of Pike like falling into the depths with his harpoon above his head and that huge mouth coming out. I'm like, that's a big nope from me, guys. Like I can't always look at that piece of artwork. It really freaks me out. Sorry. There are sharks in the real world as well. I've done extensive studies, know thy enemy and all that. Like a nurse shark, like that doesn't sound real, or a tiger shark, and that's two different real world creatures sort of mashed together. So I think Berserker shark, it sounds like a scary fantasy version of a shark, and you understand immediately what a berserker shark is from context. Axefin Leviathan, you understand that. A razorfin. Okay, I'm beginning to see where these things are. The thing for me is making sure that this is consistent throughout stories and that we don't invent 15 different kinds of things when we already have something that fulfills that role. And I think that's just about keeping track of what we already have, and I think that's something editors within narrative are kind of taking ownership of. We're building these glossary lists and like, oh, we talked about Axefin Leviathan in this product and this is what that meant in context. So if you want to talk about a huge thing that you're dragging back to port, you could consider, these are the 5 different species that we've already talked about that exist within the world.
Yeah.
So, and if there are words that are just completely made up ones, then I think we just need to be conscious about like how often they're used or how well they're explained. I mean, things like the word yordle or darken or Vestia all don't really mean anything without context, but we sort of all understand what they are, probably just because we've all used them or seen them so much.
So you heard it here first, folks. The reason why all the fish in the League of Legends universe are terrifying is because Scathlocke is terrified of the ocean. Excellent.
Confirmed.
It's canon now. So speaking of going back to the actual Ophidian, after this little tangent I took us on, Nautilus in the story has no voice lines. Like, he says nothing. He just shows up, smashes the ship, and then Lars is left to make assumptions about why he did that. So why keep Nautilus completely silent? Was just to make him scarier, or is that part of the characterization that he just doesn't talk, he just destroys things?
From my perspective, it was pretty much just to make him scarier. As these kind of like, this was a dark, scary tale. Having his ship pulled under the ocean by this giant, like, hideous, well, it's not hideous, but giant, scary, big thing was pretty scary. But having him sort of chatting as he did it, that might have broken it a little bit for me. So yeah, for me, it was kind of more of the colossal, silent, scary thing from the depths, pulling his ship down, which
it does tie.
Is the hook that I was thinking of. It
does tie in as well to talking about League Champion VO. Is it canon? Is it not canon? And all of the VO that the writers on League and writers and editors have a fantastic, robust process by which they decide like what kind of lines are appropriate for a champion, and what the aim of that is, and like whether should they be referring to their current experience on the map in the game, or should they be referring to wider lore concepts. And there's a really tricky balance to strike. But the aim of in-game VO for any of these kind of characters, any of these kind of experiences, and I guess in any game by any publisher, the idea of what VO represents is to build on the player fantasy of what it would be like to be that champion. But like, it's hard to imagine what you would be like if you were an avatar of the depths, and like responsible for, it's a human mindset that's been changed so much by that character's experiences, but it needs to be accessible to the player. They need to understand what it is. So I think those I love the balance that's being struck more recently with some of the newer scripts, where it's not just about like this character makes a funny joke to that other character while they're waiting for the creatures in the jungle to spawn, those interactions are very true to who the characters are, but they're probably not actually things that they have said to one another in real life. And I think it's an interest in real life. What am I talking about? These fictional characters.
You've
in real
played
life.
too much Summoner's Rift, mate.
That's it. And I'm still terrible at League. So what does that say? But I love and again, I have a couple of favorite champions, as we all do. Like Swain's VO, I think, is fantastic. He's very much in his own head. He never, it very rarely breaks that immersion. And then some of the older champions, it regularly breaks immersion, breaks the fourth wall, referring specifically to the player in some cases for really, really old VO.
So now,
well, yeah, we're trying to figure it out. But yes, having an understanding of what VO represents, and I think it could be very possible that maybe Nautilus has a lot of thoughts in his own head. Maybe in order to understand that, it's expressed as VO, but maybe he doesn't talk. We don't know. I mean, this is probably, I think, one of the only times we've seen him in a story, maybe?
Yeah, outside of like a New Dawn cinematic.
Yeah, I think we'd like to get a better understanding with all of these champions, like how they are expressed in the game is very... I mean, even between, like, let's say between League and TFT, like, that's a very different game experience, and the VO is modified and different. And like, if we were to think about other expressions of those champions within other stories or within other other media, maybe it's what's the overall like appropriate way to understand that character. And I think specifically to this story, having him as a silent thing from beneath the waves, I mean, he didn't speak to Lars, I think is basically how Lars remembers it. This giant thing that came up from beneath the waves and dragged my ship to the depths. He didn't talk to me, so I'm not going to recount that in my tale.
Yeah. So, moving on to the Fizz story, because we do have a limited amount of time. So, Lars, in this story, like, you have him talking to children. And first, let's talk about those children. Where did you get those voice lines for the kids?
Those children, that's Ariel's daughters. It was so adorable. We were talking, as I was saying, Sean had been trying to find realistic sounding children's voices from the like sound effects libraries and so on. And he'd been really kind of stressing about this because everything sounded terrible and fake, and you could hear some of this was really well known like voice clips that have been used in many products by many different companies. And he was like, I just don't know that we're going to be able to do this. Like, we don't have authentic sounding children's voices that can react in the way that we need to as dictated by the script. And Ariel just suddenly picked up her phone, called her husband and said, are you guys busy right now? And like literally her husband just drove their daughters to Riot, and we immediately took them straight into the recording booth. And again, David Liley, who was serving as the director for the voice sessions, he is fantastic at directing children, and to watch him work, it was an absolute pleasure. And it was the way that he was explaining they weren't reading the script, but he was telling them like, okay, so imagine your sister's just given you some candy, like, how does that, are you excited? Oh, we're going to go and see grandma or something like that. And those are those little giggles and laughs. It's like, and I'm going to show you something in this pop-up book, and they start giggling and so on, and it was so adorable to see. And
that sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's a real talent to be able to direct children as well as you direct adults, and that's, again, very talented folks at Riot. But I think if we'd had a lot more time, we could have had those two adorable girls could have been in the studio all day, and we could have had so much more. But I think it was interesting that all of the recordings of the children, there's no actual words in there. It's all it's pure emotional responses to the things that are happening in the script as filtered through David's understanding of children in the real world.
That's a lovely story. So having Lars like telling the story to the kids, it makes him out to be this kind of fun uncle, this very sympathetic character. I can't help but feel like a part of the point of making him sympathetic was to make it sting all the more when Pike eventually kills him. Like, was that part of the consideration, or was it more just, well, we want to make the Fizz story a kid story?
I think it was a bit of both, really. I think the thought was definitely there to make it sting a little bit more, and I think it stung a bit more, particularly for me, because I think the Fizz story was when I really kind of fell in love with Lars, with writing him.
You're a monster, Ant. You're an absolute monster.
Yeah, and then that sort of carried through into the Tahm Kench one, because that sort of was when it really started turning into a tragedy. But yeah, the Fizz one was definitely when I started to go, I really like this character, actually. He's good with kids. I mean, he's telling them a story that perhaps is a bit inappropriate for them, but I think a lot of the best kids stories do have that little bit of darkness in them, or maybe that was just my upbringing. Maybe that says a lot about the stories that I write. But yeah, I just kind of like the idea, and we're trying to figure out how to fit Fizz into this lot too. When you've got like Pike and what he's all about, and Kench, and Nautilus as well. Fizz was kind of a little bit of the odd one out in terms of his tone, and I thought that doing it as this kind of kid's story is just a good way of staying true to what Fizz is, but also do it in a way that still works with all the other ones, if that makes sense.
I think it shows a lot about Fizz's role within the society as well, because I think it's easy to assume, oh yeah, he hangs out with Misfortune and Gangplank. Like, probably not. I think we say in the bio that he lives in the reefs outside of Bilgewater. He probably has his own friends, or his own social circle maybe, and when he comes into Bilgewater, which is in terms of regions of Runeterra, that's kind of the closest place that he's affiliated with, but he's not hanging out in the bar, I don't think, talking to people.
Well, I suppose depending on the type of story that we're telling, because I think for some type of stories that could work perfectly fine, but in other stories it would be incredibly jarring, I think. So I think for setting it up with Lars and how we've introduced the other ones, yeah, if Fizz was just sitting beside him in the bar, it would be weird. But yeah, so this was a way that we sort of came up with of going, how do we introduce him in a way that seems real to this kind of version of the universe, at least, while keeping him kind of true to who he is and what he's all about as the sort of prankster.
Yeah, because what I really, really liked about that story is that it does such a good job of establishing that Fizz is this character who's fun to the children because he's a trickster, but sailors are terrified of him because, holy crap, he steals the tithe, he brings down the wrath of Nautilus, oh my god. So I really liked that tension between, making it believable that he's a horror story to the sailors, but kids love him because they don't go out into the ocean and get murdered by his antics.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of some of my favorite kids' stories are a bit like that. You can read them as a kid and really enjoy them for what they are, and you read it as an adult and are slightly horrified or more scared by it because you sort of see the subtext, and I just find that interplay really interesting.
Okay, so the reveal that Fizz is the one who took the tithe that sunk... I mean, I assume from the context of the story that basically this thing with Fizz happens more or less immediately after the Ophidian has been sunk by Nautilus?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, so it's Fizz that took the tithe that sunk the Ophidian. The one little thing that kind of struck me is that for us reading the story, the fact that Fizz took the tithe is that's a reveal. That's that's why he's scared of him. But the kids don't really understand that context because they didn't hear the story about the Ophidian. And that seemed a little bit awkward to me. Was that just kind of an inevitable thing of, we have no other way to do that?
I think there's a great kind of... I think this comes back to something Ant mentioned before. The story still works on its own. But perhaps, I think if you read both stories, then you get more of a sense of how they connect together. And I think one of the things that we always bear in mind from an editorial point of view with every single story, we assume there is at least one person somewhere in the world. This will be the first piece of fiction they've ever read to do with League of Legends, and in some cases it might be the only piece of fiction they ever read, and it still has to make sense. And I love interconnected stories, and I think interconnected color stories are really interesting as well. Just point out the connections between David Slagle's Swain color story and the LeBlanc color story that I wrote. If you read them both, you get a different level of understanding, but you could read either of them separately and they would still be a satisfying expression of that champion and their place in the world. And I think for this the story that Lars is telling those children, it's not necessarily as important what Nautilus did to that ship so much as how that relates to Fizz, how that relates to those kids' experience of that story and that character. And he's telling them about Fizz, and he's making out this kind of perhaps well-meaning little terror that he is. You drop your coin, I brought it back for you. But I think the way that comes across, he might actually be very friendly. This is the thing which I think was really, really important. Is we're not saying that Fizz is evil. We're not saying that he's malicious and terrifying in his heart. We're saying that the way that he is perceived by people can be terrifying. It's that's a scary little thing because it's not
the inadvertent disaster that he's caused.
And he thinks this is my new friend who I saved from the the sharks. Like, I saved him. I'm going to go hang out with him in his house where he lives now. And I'm like, I'm going to give him some eels and put them under his blankets. Or I'll tie his shoes together. He'll find that funny. And then giving him. I really. Oh my god! So again, you were talking about scary stories from childhood. There was a book which turns out is based on like a northeastern American folk tale called Tailipo, and that when you wrote this thing about Fizz where he's walking like his feet slapping on the floor as he approaches Lars, who's cowering under his bed sheets, I just immediately thought of this folk tale Tailipo. That terrified me and my sister when we were young. And it's the idea of like, this thing is, it's every child's nightmare. There is a thing that is not friendly and you don't know what it wants right outside the bed covers. It's gonna grab your feet, or it's gonna like something horrifying, and he just does nothing. He's like, yeah, you drop your coin, I left it on the bedside table, you're welcome. And then, like, clearly doesn't want to be friends, so I'm going to give him the coin back. And I think you could see this from Fizz's point of view. It might be a really sad story, like the day Fizz didn't make a friend. It's like, oh,
definitely write that follow-up color story. Definitely do that.
Getting back to what you were originally asking, it was kind of part of the brief, I think, with these ones, that they all needed to be standalone. So you could hear each one individually, and they should work as their own standalone thing. But yeah, if you put them all together, you just happen to get a bit more understanding, a bit more out of it, which is actually one of those things, I think, which is a bit of a trick when writing anything in a big shared universe, is that balance of like how much assumed knowledge is there versus what new stuff can we tell people. And I as a fan myself, in different IPs, I always love it when you get by reading all of it or consuming all of it or listening to all of it, you get more understanding, and you can put those things together and you go, oh, that's an Easter egg towards that, or that's telling you something about that. But if you don't have that knowledge, that's okay too. Like, it rewards you for being like a big fan, but if you're not, it's not like it's excluding you. You know what I mean? I think that was quite an important thing that we're trying to hit with this.
That actually leads me to a question I wanted to ask about some of the behind-the-scenes production stuff. You released this thing, in terms of what you were saying, Laurie, about how this might be the only thing that someone ever reads in the League of Legends universe. You released pretty much all of these stories like all at once, basically. What was the decision about like releasing them very close together rather than like spreading them out like as a weekly thing? Come back next week to hear the next terrifying tale from like that kind of thing.
It's interesting. It's like we originally thought that it would be. This is why it's broken into, I think, you got the 4 sort of main pieces and then the bookend, so the 6 separate things. We had two expressions of this in mind when we were working on the script and we're breaking out the script for recording and so on. We had the thought that it would be all one long piece with like, it would just be a single thing of like 26 minutes, and it would maybe even have opening titles read by a narrator or something, and then credits at the end, maybe, like that kind of thing. So it'd be kind of like a full self-contained half-hour audio drama kind of thing. But then I think as it was being built into the publishing campaign and they kind of got an idea of what it was we were actually aiming for, they said, can we break this into pieces? And I totally assumed, yes, this is going to be serialized, it's going to be brought out across multiple days. And I think that was the plan, was to do a piece every day up to the release of Pike, and then release Pike's on the day that he came out, so people would get like a big drop of lore all on that same day. And then that was what we were working towards when it was broken out into individual pieces. But then I think at some point somebody was more comfortable with it if we could just ship it all in one go. And I think every decision that Riot makes about the way they publish stuff and what kind of stuff is focused on, I believe all of it is based on actual data. It's not just a hunch. It's not just we want to try this thing. The amount of information that we consider, even about which bios we're going to update to accompany a new champion, or what kinds of stories we want to tell, or where we want to tell those stories, or who should write them, or any of those things, is informed by information about like how that stuff might have performed previously, or what's the closest thing we can imagine to it that's already been done. And I guess at some point somebody sort of compared the numbers and figured it would be better to release it as pieces but all in one go. And I think that's fine. I was on the understanding it would be released in a build up to Pike's launch, but then also that then competes with other parts of the promotional campaign, and we don't want to compete with ourselves. I think that, cannibalizing one piece of content over another doesn't seem wise. But I think as long people having the option to dip in and out, and it's interesting. You look at the stuff's hosted on YouTube, the audio hosted on YouTube. You can see the different viewing numbers for the different stories, and even that in itself is interesting. Like which champions folks were most interested in hearing about, as opposed to if every single video had the same number of views, that would also tell us something. But there's I think Nautilus is the one that has the most views as of right now.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think that's probably also because it's the first one in the series. Like, this is something I know from being a YouTuber, is like the longer something is, the more of a drop-off you get as people, for whatever reason, lose interest. That's probably why the numbers on the later ones are a little bit lower.
And it also could be that they don't lose interest at all. You click on something and then 15 minutes in, oh God, I have to go to work.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, there's somebody at the door. And so you turn it off, you come back to it and you play it again, and you start from the same point again. So you get 2 listens to some of it and only 1 listen to it. So yeah, exactly. It's diminishing returns the longer something is, I think.
Yeah, and that's just the YouTube game, unfortunately. So, moving on to the Tahm Kench story, I really liked the narrative through line of the Gold Kraken. Like that, I thought that was a really, really clever way to string things together. That first his ship sinks because of that gold coin, then Fizz haunts him because of the gold coin, then Tahm Kench uses the gold coin to tempt him, and then... Well, we'll talk about that with Pike at the end, but I thought that was very clever. Like, was that planned out from the start, again, in terms of being interconnected, or was that a happy little accident?
I think, if I recall right, that was something that we came up with when we started thinking about the Fizz one. It's like, what's the Fizz story all about? What's he doing? Or maybe bring something back to him. Or what if it was something, and then it was all sort of started to tie together to the first one, and then it was like, that just led sort of naturally into, well, there's this demonic gambler character who kind of would make thematic sense for him to tempt him with the same sort of coin. So yeah, that's kind of all came through from that.
I think we knew what champions we wanted to cover, but we didn't know what order we wanted to cover them. And I think this was the way to explain, some of the horror of, the Tithe and Nautilus and Bilgewater as a place, and then explaining why that, it's called it, kind of fury was brought down upon that ship, and then seeing how it was a through line that had emerged as we kind of started fitting these pieces of these stories together, as Anne said. But then also there's a great kind of it says something very much about Bilgewater as a place, like the kind of the culture, the kind of thing where somebody weighing up their superstitions alongside their need to not spend their last coin, and maybe finding justifications for it. And I think at one point he says, like, no, I'm not spending this, and like, no, I'm not going to gamble with it, because essentially he's trying to justify not spending his last gold coin. But then there's all of this other superstition, all these other things that you can layer on top of that. And I think at one point we were talking about there's that wonderful little animation thing for the video, which is just a bar with flickering candlelight and kind of building the background of that scene. I think originally it was going to be a gold Kraken coin just rotating on a black background, and I think that would have been far less intriguing than what we had, and I think it would have been a bit more leading. I think it was something that was discussed early on, like a 3D coin just turning slowly in the candlelight. Like, it felt a bit abstract compared to, let's see where he is, where they're sat in a kind of slightly animated way, not actually a full animation.
Yeah. Okay, so the story itself, this is the Tahm Kench story is my favorite one out of all of them, because it does such a good job of selling what it is Tahm Kench does. Because I remember when he was first released, I really liked him, but I wasn't really clear on, so he eats people, but if he just wants to eat people, then why does he have to do this whole temptation song and dance before he eats them? Like, and this story did a really good job of making it more clear that, no, Tahm eats misery and sadness and broken expectations and despair. Like, and that's a really good way to express it.
It turns out there's a lot of that in the world, so he's never really going hungry.
Yeah.
This one made me feel really sad to write.
Yeah, it was a rough one. Like, poor Lars, really.
Yeah, I mean, there was a couple of lines in there that gave me ridiculous giggles. I think it was just particularly about the bit when he had to sell his leg for chum.
Oh yeah.
But this is sort of when everything took a horribly tragic turn. So yeah, this was a downer a little bit. But he learnt. I mean, it was a learning experience.
Props to the voice actor for both doing the Lars accent and then doing a really solid imitation of Tahm Kench. Like that
it was amazing.
That's some impressive acting.
Yeah, I mean, he was a fantastic voice actor. He really brought Lars to life. But yeah, his two coats, or particularly it was like his version of Lars doing two coats.
Yeah,
that's the really difficult thing of doing an impression while in character.
Yeah.
Oh, it was amazing.
When I did the reading for the narrative folks, for some reason I went totally with the kind of the British kind of West Country, or like Somerset kind of classic Treasure Island accent, which that was just where my mind went with it, because that's the kind of, we're telling a sailor story, and then when we brought the actor in, and he's from California, like he's American, and he said, "Oh yeah, no, I've lived in."
Really? He's American. And he can do a West Country accent like that.
So the accent that he did, he actually said, "Oh, would you like me to do Northern?" And I was like, "Oh, okay." And I thought, we're going to get Jon Snow, aren't we? That's basically what we're going for. And he even said, "Would you like me to go Preston or would you like me to go Liverpool?" I was like, "Oh wow, okay. Well, can you give me a demo of each?" And he delivered these perfect accents. Like I could see almost on the map of Britain where he was moving with his accent, and it was so specific and so perfect. I think in the entire thing there was only 2 slight slips in his accent, and I was like, oh wow, this guy really, really can do amazing accents. And then, as you say, to then do a northern, I think it's like Lancashire kind of area accent that he settled on, and then to then do Tahm Kench's southern drawl in the voice of somebody from a very specific regional British accent. It's fantastic. I was very impressed.
That really, really impressed me when I heard it the first time. And you say you kind of wrote the accent into the script. Like, did you try to lead him towards that kind of an accent, or did he kind of just take it and run with it?
He just took it and ran with it, and it sounded a hell of a lot better than I could have tried. So it sounded better than it did in my head when he started reading it. So it's like he just really embodied this character and brought him to life. So, and I think that's a huge part of why this works. Really, like is the real character that he gave to this. To Lars. He was the one that really made me feel for him. He was the one that really made me like him during the Fizz one and feel terrible about what was going to happen. I say as I laugh.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the love of fictional characters. You can kill them and laugh about it, and it's okay. You're not a sociopath. You're just a writer.
I think he's onto us, Ant. He's onto us. Oh god.
So, speaking of Lars and Tahm Kench, like in the story itself, there is a pretty extensive explanation of like the metaphysics of Tahm Kench, where we have the actor saying he feeds on misery, as old as sin and older than Bilgewater, been around since the start of things, gorging himself on the desperation that comes with the greed and sorrow in men's hearts. Like, one criticism I had of the story is that, like, Lars seems to have a distressing amount of metaphysical insight into exactly how this demon works, as opposed to him, he could probably figure out that he feeds on misery, but how does he know that Tahm is older than Bilgewater, or, like, that he's been around since forever? That was a little unclear to me.
This feels like it's that thing, it keys back into the title of the thing, which is Legends of Bilgewater, and I think this might just be, that is what is commonly known about Tahm Kench by people in Bilgewater, and even like specifically calling him Old Two Coats, and it's kind of that devil kind of going by many names thing that you have in many cultures in the real world as well. Like the idea that this is the stuff that they know or they believe to be true about him. He's just repeating the common knowledge. as it turns out, like for the purposes of this story, it's probably pretty close to what we considered to be the truth of Tahm Kench, at least through the cultural lens of what people of Bilgewater would understand that to be. And
because I would have expected the people of Bilgewater to have more misconceptions about him rather than an accurate understanding of what he's actually doing.
I feel like if we gave somebody this level of spotlight and then told all the players something that was just factually wrong, I feel like we might just end up
you might cause trouble.
Yeah, we're just tying ourselves in knots, and then we have to explain why those people think that's wrong, and then we have to issue a statement.
Yeah. Oh God, statements. Hate to see them.
But yeah, I think Laurie hits that one. I was pretty much thinking like this is probably a thing that has had a lot of stories told around him over the years, and this is pretty much like what everyone believes. Everyone sort of knows what this demon is all about, kind of thing, and that's just the common knowledge.
All right, so let's move on to the final story of the compilation, which is Pike the Drowned Man, which is different from the others in that it's the one story that Lars isn't telling, but actually experiencing. Like, was that a like in terms of everything else so far has been stories that have been told to us, and then this is the one story that we get to experience. What was the thought process behind taking it from that realm of distance to that immediacy?
This goes back to that sort of audio sketch that Brian had put together, and it was the idea of, as you say, like this isn't a story he's telling, it's a story that he's going to live and die through. The idea that imagine if this was what had happened to him and he had survived, how would he then tell that story? Because I doubt it would be exactly the way that we heard it happen. I think he would embellish it, he would take it in other directions. And for me, there's a kind of
4 pikes came out of the fog.
Exactly, yeah. And you should see his eyes blazing in the dark, that kind of thing. But the idea of this keyed into it came up as an interesting thing for me with the Blair Witch, the early Blair Witch movies, the first 2, where you see that footage, like this is what the camera sees, like this is as far as we can tell, the objective truth of what happened to those people. And then in the next one you see, spoiler alert for something that's nearly 20 years old, you then see that what those people experience might not be literally what we saw happen, or that's certainly the hint that's given. The idea that what they believe is happening might not be what objectively did happen. I think there's an element of that with this, of like the stories that he's telling about Nautilus, about Fizz, about Tahm Kench, they're through his experience, but he is the storyteller. He decides how that story is told, and then to see something literally unfolding, he comes across slightly differently when we actually hear him like interacting with Pike. And he's not, I know he was embellishing his interactions with Fizz for an audience of children, and he's trying to persuade somebody to buy him a drink with the first, like that kind of thing. But then this is as close to who Lars actually is as we're ever likely to find out, at least in the context of this audio drama. And he's actually not a helpless guy. He's not just a nice, kindly drunk guy in the bar, because he takes on Pike. He like stabs him and drops him in the docks. Like that's like that. He's far from helpless. And I think that and we talked about this a little bit before. Like we weren't sure who this character would be, the POV storyteller character, and we had a lot of thoughts around like what would it be appropriate for this character to be like, and I think not being helpless was one of the things that we should point out.
Yeah, I mean and this is also him when he's like old and washed up and got one leg. So you can imagine when he was younger, he probably would have been a bit more hard as well. Like he was a member of the slaughter fleets. So this would have been a pretty tough bloke, I think. So yeah, definitely having him not just being a sort of a complete victim in this regard was something that was quite important. This was kind of a weird one to write. It was the strangest of them all to write, partly because the lines for Pike had already been recorded by this point, and we didn't have the time to get the actor who did Pike back into the studio. So we know we wanted to have Pike speak in this and have him speak with Lars, but it was kind of weird having to I was trawling through like the Pike lines, looking to see what lines would work, and then trying to write Lars lines that would sort of play off that to make it sound like they were kind of having a conversation.
That was the task, wasn't it? Where you said, I don't know what Pike's lines are if we can't record him fresh, so I had to go and find the VO script for you and like email it. I was like, this, like, see what works, engineer a conversation as close to make sense around these lines. I think it works quite well, like, especially, and this comes back to what we're saying about VO, like, is VO canon? The idea that Pike's kind of fractured mind, and he manufactures, like, you know, reasons to kill certain folks, like, there's probably a great deal of repetition in his thought process as he kind of figures that through. The idea that he might say the same thing over and over again, suddenly that keys into Champion VO very well, very clearly. Like, that's a line that Pike says, like a little reference here and there.
Yeah,
that brings up another point, actually. Why make Lars a justified target? Because, like, the whole thing about Pike is that he has this fractured mind that has interacted with something terrible below the ocean, and now he just has this ever-growing list of targets that he never understands that this list keeps growing. These names are new. I don't actually know these people. He manufactures reasons to kill people. He has this brain that just kind of comes up with whatever memories he needs to justify stabbing whoever he's looking at. So why make Lars why make Lars someone who actually knows him, who was there, who did cut the line?
I think for me, the reason we went this direction was simply so we can have Lars recognize him and actually say his name. Because if it was just a stranger to him, like, we can't see him, and it's not like prose, so you couldn't describe him. So it could be almost anything. Whereas having Lars actually go, oh, "You're Pike. I remember you. You died," kind of thing, is just a really clear way, I think, of just going, "Oh, okay, this is Pike." This is also the first time, like, a lot of players might have heard of Pike or seen him. Being that it was kind of like going out with him around the same sort of time. So I think that was it. It was pretty much very pragmatic. I wanted Lars to say, "You are Pike," and essentially.
It was very possibly, when we were talking before about the original plan to release this as pieces building up to the release of Pike, it could be literally this is the first time anyone's ever said the name Pike. We had to kind of factor that in a little bit. Like, if Pike had not yet been revealed, to then kind of tease that in. I think I'd love to see if we can do more of that in future without talking, you know, too specifically about future plans. We have started laying the groundwork for many things that we know are coming in the next, like, little bit of time, with stories that have been told for probably the last year or so. And I think, like, seeing, for example, with how we knew that Silas's rebellion would kind of turn out and would result in the death of the king. Spoiler for anyone that's not read the comic at this stage. But, like, we knew about that, I think 18 months before Silas came out. And it was something that we talked about, I think, way back in, like, 2017. Like, why is he called Jarvan the Fourth if he's not the king? And just trying to understand, like, how, you know, patrilineal succession kind of works, and kind of, like, the champion fantasy is that he is Jarvan the Fourth and heir to the throne. It's like he's Prince Jarvan right now, but he will eventually become King Jarvan the Fourth, and trying to just start to move the world towards that. Also building that into the idea of somebody that wants to overthrow the monarchy entirely. So we can start to do that stuff well ahead of time. And I think this is like a micro version of that, where we thought we might be giving people a little bit of insight into Pike before anything else was announced about him. But dropping names in, even just adding in opportunities, hooks, seeds of ideas that we can then pay off later or not as required. I'd like to see us doing more of that as we move forward, and not just be moving almost like kind of living hand to mouth with our storytelling. Like, oh, there's going to be this champion coming out, we're going to tell a story on the day they come out, and then that's it, and we won't touch them again. It's like, that doesn't feel as authentic as, you know, part of the world, part of the setting that we should really be aiming for something deeper than that.
Yeah. So, actually, speaking of Pike, like, this was being a tease for Pike himself. Like, when it comes to like documenting action in an audio drama, there's always that trouble where you have to have enough sound to communicate what's going on, but you can't just narrate the fight as it goes on. And the thing that kind of struck me with Pike is when I heard this thing for the first time, I had no idea what was happening in the fight, because I had never heard Pike's animation and his sound effects, and I didn't really know. Oh wait, what ability is he using? What's this thing where he seems to disappear? I guess. Okay, like so how was it like to try and kind of balance that out?
Yeah, that one was kind of it was tricky. I don't know that I have a fantastic answer with this one. It's sometimes with audio, like you have a narrator, and then you could like not an in-world narrator, but like you actually have a narrator that's saying this is happening, this is what's going on.
It's that kind of
and then
third-person omniscient.
Omniscient.
Yeah, there we go.
Kind of, yeah, so you, like and if we had established that earlier on, that would probably make this scene quite clear. But then that would have changed the whole direction of the whole audios. So we tried to balance something here that just kind of evoked what was going on without you having to need to know exactly every movement that was going on.
Yeah.
This is really interesting to me as well, because this is kind of why we've decided to release the script.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You had that audio of Pike fighting someone that you started from, and then you ended with it. But players didn't really have the context to understand that thing yet.
Exactly, yeah. And I think like I think this is a great audio drama. It's really exciting to listen to all the way through, and I think it did a lot of great storytelling along the way. But would we do it differently if we had more time? If we went back and told these stories
in more than 72 hours,
more than 72 hours around to write this, that kind of thing. So actually, I'll just quickly mention a player called Alyssa, reached out to me on Twitter and said that she was doing a fan animation of Legends of Bilgewater, and this is just something that she would like to, I think it's for studies or something, but just saying she would like to use the audio as the backing, and then kind of animate the events. And she had a couple of questions for me, and she was talking about when Lars goes back to his home and sort of lies down on his bed, and I was like, I don't remember that, and I had to go back to the script and look. I was like, I don't think that happens. And I think I replied to her tweets initially, and she was saying, is there any way I could see the script? And I was like, you know what, I think we should release the script. So Alyssa, you're the reason we're releasing this script today.
Shoutouts to Alyssa. Thank you very much, because that's the reason I get to talk to these guys.
There we go. But yeah, I think it was interesting how different people interpreted the sounds they were hearing in different ways, but everybody sort of arrived at the same conclusion, which is bad things happen.
Yeah.
Bad things happen to Lars, basically.
Yeah. All right, well, that kind of exhausts the questions that I specifically had. So I guess here at the end I'd ask, to jump off what we were just talking about in terms of like this was being a very rapid process and being the first time you've really done an audio drama and a lot of firsts and a lot of thinking on your feet. What did you kind of learn from this? Like in terms of if we were doing this again, were there any takeaways that you got, any internal feedback that would be interesting to share?
What we learned was that folks who didn't get a version of this translated for their real world region, they really, really want to hear this in their own languages. And I think we left it open so that it could be translated, but eventually it came down to the individual teams in those countries and regions deciding whether or not there was time for them to do it. And I think what I would love to do is, if we're going to do this again, if we get back to doing more different audio dramas, more varied, I want to include more different languages. I'd want everybody to be able to experience these things. And I mentioned before, talking with Dirk Maggs, a very experienced audio drama producer, director. This is one of the things that he and I have talked about, is the idea of how does a single audio drama get spun out into multiple other languages for release, all simultaneous releases, and that's really exciting. That's something we can look into more in future. But just the idea of being able to do more audio dramas, I think everybody was like, I really enjoyed this. I would much rather listen to an audio drama, an evocative story being told to me, because then I can play a game of League, I can turn off the game audio, and I can just listen to Lars being murdered multiple times, depending on how long your game of League lasts.
Remember, he's not a sociopath; he's a writer.
He's a writer of a kind. We're all storytellers. That's what this is. Not saying that Ant tells stories in bars to strangers and avoids spending his own dollars. That's neither confirmed nor denied.
That's a vicious rumor.
Yeah. So, Ant, in terms of the writing on this thing, when you look back at it now with some distance on it, is there anything that kind of jumps out to you as, ooh, I should have expanded on that, or ooh, I should have cut that down a little bit, or ooh, if only we could have told a little bit more about this thing?
Yeah, I think the last part, the Pike part, is probably the part that bumps me the most looking at it now. Although there were some fun little bits in there. Like, I like the idea of Lars. There's a little bit in there when he's laughing at like one of the jokes he said in his previous thing, which I think those little touches are kind of fun. But I think that last piece, for my mind, wasn't as successful as the other ones. That jump to being like more in the moment, I think, is a cool idea. But audio without any narration can make something like you were pointing out, can make that action a little bit more difficult to follow what's going on. So I think in retrospect, I'd probably approach that one a little bit differently.
Maybe with the actor in, so you could actually record voice lines and stuff.
That would
Pike
probably be helpful. That would probably be helpful. But in terms of like the writing and stuff, it was so much fun. I mean, I love writing audio. This one was interesting and fun because it was very much all in Lars's voice for the most part, which I think is really a really fun way to tell stories. I think it works particularly well for small pieces though, like these like little individual bits. I don't know that I'd want to have, like, if it was multiple hours, like a novel length, I don't think I'd want to hear that all from one person's telling the story. Like, I think that's when you can, like, multiple actors, different people playing different characters and stuff like that, as it's and happening in the moment, I think would probably work better for longer pieces. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like, it's just super fun to write. It's getting the right voice actors is huge. Like, these actors were fantastic, and like they really brought it to life. And the sound design guys are fantastic too. Like, you have the wrong voice and it just doesn't. It sort of brings down the whole writing. Whereas you have a great actor and they lift it, like they make it sound so much better than I could have ever hoped. So it was just super interesting. It's just very interesting. Writing can often be a little bit of a solo kind of exercise, or at least writing with it, working with an editor and stuff like that. But working on a piece like this, it makes it incredibly collaborative, and that's just a really fun thing to be a part of.
I think that's kind of, we put that on the script to make it clear. Like, there's a bunch of folks who worked on this. So Daniel Kautz and Michael Viska, Abigail Harvey, like all helping out with the editorial side. But like, I feel like for me and Ant working on this initially, when it was kind of developing the story ideas, it felt like Ant was telling the story and I was trying to figure out, okay, is there anything else we can do to make this work better in audio? And as it happens, Ant knows exactly how to write for audio, so it was a really smooth, that end of things was really smooth and really, really enjoyable. And yeah, we would have loved to have more time, but the actual creation of the scripts from Ant's story ideas and from the drafts that we were producing, I think that was the smoothest part of this. I really enjoyed that.
So with the 10th anniversary coming up now that we're at the end of our main discussion, with the 10th anniversary starting to get into swing, I think as this goes up, we will have the live stream already going. Is there anything that you guys have been working on that you might want to tease us with a little bit? Any hints? Anything any juicy details you can give us?
I'm really excited to see a big announcement like last month or something. Realms of Runeterra, like it's the first kind of worldwide book release that Riot has, actual story content, lore content that we've done. I came, Ant invited me to come to Riot Games in like 2016, 2017, because the idea was that we were going to get to do books, and now we are actually doing books. It's awesome. It's so exciting to see that coming to fruition.
We like books. Books are good. We like
books. We're book people. Let's put it that way. Book people and audio drama people. But I mean, and you have a story in there. You're one of the authors who has a story in the book.
Yeah. I've written a Freljord story for that book, which I guess is a bit of a spoiler, but not that much of a spoiler. Which is really fun to write. I love the Freljord as an area to write in. I don't think I've written anything since the Eye in the Abyss, so it was really fun to get back to them. Been listening to lots of Viking Nordic music to get me in the right spirit.
You gave me some great recommendations there for folk bands and so on to listen to. So that's
and a lot of that stuff has become like some of my default writing music now.
That's my default commuting music. I put that on when I get in the car, and I'm instantly transported away from the sunshine to the nice, cold, frozen Nordic north. Nice. Yes, I'm truly European in that regard. I crave snow and rain sometimes.
They do say the further away you get from Europe, the more European you become.
That is confirmed. That is definitely true.
So actually, since I have the opportunity now to ask a question about the book, is the book basically meant to be, like we discussed with Legends of Bilgewater, is it a thing of this is the entry point, this is if you want to know a whole bunch about Runeterra, this is the book to get because that'll introduce you to all of that stuff, or is it more of a thing for the hardcore lore buffs like nerds like me, for example?
So we definitely want it to be both of those things. So I think it's saying on the book, it's an official companion book, League of Legends, Realms of Runeterra. There is some deep lore content in that book, and there's an introduction to a whole bunch of the regions of Runeterra, the realms, the spirit realm, the material realm, talking about the celestial nature of what exists above Mount Targon, and hinting at the horrors of the void beneath, and all of that stuff is foundational knowledge that if you want to understand the world beyond the game, beyond League of Legends, and how characters and champions and different stories fit into that, it's foundational knowledge. But then also, for the people who've been following the stuff and already know a bunch of this, there is a great deal of new content. The majority of the book is new story and lore, new story content with a great deal of supporting lore, some of which is also brand new. And I think there's some artwork that's never been seen before as well in there.
Oh, there's a heck of a lot of artwork that hasn't been seen. There's lots of beautiful world building artwork which we've sort of had hidden away for a long time that we've popped into there.
And I think some of it's already been previewed on like the book trade stuff at Amazon or the various places online where they have pages from the book, and people are already kind of pulling out the page and go, oh my god, look at this is new. Oh, what does this text say? Like, and trying to there is some stuff that is paraphrased or straight from Universe, and then there is a lot of stuff that is also not just straight from Universe. And I'm hoping we're gonna see a lot more people doing a lot more theory crafting, a lot more speculation. But this is both an introduction to the world and also very much a rewarding payoff for people who've already been following for as the dedicated lore heads, as we all should be.
All right. So, last thing I want to ask. I know that the Volibear and Fiddlesticks reworks are in the can, and I know there's been a lot of work done on it. Any updates that you can tell us about, or do we just have to wait for, I guess, the anniversary stream to reveal something, or maybe the champion team later on?
I think I would love to let the champion team talk more about their stuff. I just say I have seen some of the artwork for Fiddlesticks and Volibear for the reworks since they were talking about them, and it looks amazing. They both feel very much more like they fit into the world of Runeterra specifically at this point. And talking about Tahm Kench as a demon before, like the idea of how the interactions between spiritual or demonic or godlike characters fit into Runeterra is something that is very much open to interpretation across different parts of that fictional world. And I think we have a lot of stuff coming up soon where we're going to get to explore that a little more. And I'm very excited to see, but I'm going to let the champions team talk about those champions specifically.
I couldn't weasel it out of him. Sorry, guys.
Nice try.
Well, I had to give it a shot. So at the end, one thing I want to ask the both of you, is there a story on the universe that anyone has written that you'd like to recommend everybody go, like just one that you think people should read, that you really want people to see?
Oh, wow.
Oh, God, there's so many.
Yeah, there's so many great stories.
That's true. That's why I asked for one.
Oh, wow. I really like the Graham McNeil's story about the Darkin, the beginning of the Darkin being imprisoned in their weapons. I think I've forgotten what it's called. Twilight of the Gods. I think that's a really interesting story where it shows these legendary, potentially world-ending characters kind of arguing amongst themselves, and it's that thing about bringing these character experiences for champions who we think, these supremely powerful champions in the game who we think we know from VO interactions, and then seeing like, they were bickering with one another and trying to screw screw each other over. Like, oh my god, this is it. It shows like this level of authenticity to these characters, which is not just like, yeah, he's really big and my favorite champion could beat up your favorite champion, and then just endless arguments about that. I have far less time for that than I do for like, this is an expression of these characters and the non-champion characters who give context to the world and give context to those kind of historical events that we think we know about.
That's the one I was going to say. You just stolen my thunder. I think it probably depends on what someone's after. Like, because I find like someone might have a particular thing about a particular region or a particular tone or something, and I probably would like to tailor. This is a woolly answer, I know. I'd probably like to tailor my recommendation towards what something that someone might enjoy.
So give us the recommendation if you had to recommend one to yourself.
Oh god, probably the one that Laurie had just said. I like that I like the epic stuff, the big epic kind of things like that. Having said that, I also really enjoyed Amanda Jeffries' Vega story.
Oh, the beast, the Bolum Tower story, yeah.
Yeah, the true and ghastly tale of the beast.
That's really good. I really like that one as well.
Yeah,
I
just for something
which is that one as well.
Yeah, just for something as a different tone, like which is great. Like, you wouldn't want everything in the universe to have the same kind of tone.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
that one.
I'll put links to both of those down in the description then, and I would like all of you to go and give them a shot.
I think as
give
well,
them a read, because there's a bunch of good stories.
It's worth talking as well, if we're talking about Legends of Bilgewater. You have the Lost Tales of Ornn by Matt Dunn, which is that could have worked as an audio drama. We could have totally had those stories being told, and it's that idea of, but why these stories? Why is this person choosing to tell these stories? And what is the purpose of that? And I think like that's another great. I was the editor on that story. I really enjoyed working with Matt on that piece. I think that's another. If you liked Legends of Bilgewater, you should check out Lost Tales of Ornn.
Yeah, that worked really well. It's like mythic kind of stuff. It's very fitting for the Freljord and great for those champions.
All right. I'll put links to all of those down in the description, and shout out to, who was the person who contacted you on Twitter about the script, Laurie?
Oh, that was Alyssa Bevan.
Shout out to Alyssa. You get full credit for this thing coming together at all, because that script is basically why Laurie and Ant reached out to me in order to have this conversation. So if you would like me to try and get these two guys together for more conversations about League of Legends lore in the future, well, you could always leave a like and a comment down below, or go bother Laurie on Twitter. I'm sure he's happy to have his mentions filled up with stuff that isn't necessarily about champions.
Or Star Wars toys. Star Wars toys is my other thing.
And so here at the end, I will say thank you very much to Laurie and Ant for showing up and talking to me in this. I very much enjoyed this. I kept meaning to reach out to ask if you guys want to come on and talk about something, and now finally it happened. So I'm very happy with all of this. The rest of you, please go to the description, download the PDF of Legends of Bilgewater so you can see exactly what we've been sitting here and talking about this whole time, and go rewatch them. Like, they're great audio dramas. And what else? Like, comment, subscribe. I have a Patreon, all of that plugging stuff. This video is too long already. So, Laurie and Ant, anything you want to say right here at the end? I think this has been an absolute blast. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for inviting us. And I hope everybody out there continues to enjoy the stories we're going to keep telling.
Yeah, for sure. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having us on. If just keep reading stories. If people are reading them, we'll be allowed to keep writing them, which is fun, and we like that. So, yay! Stories
I get
good.
to keep having a YouTube channel, so please.